All right, everyone, welcome along. Training Tuesday. So week 11, okay? Did a couple of videos last week. I hope you watched both of them. It's important you understood the whole concept of where we got to, right? But now we need to understand what we've introduced, okay? We've introduced the monster. We've introduced what can be the worst part about data analytics and is something that you and me as data professionals have to work actively to break down and prevent. Because if we don't do it, I can guarantee all we will ever do is channel it further and further into our audiences. And rather than supporting them and helping our business become more data driven, more data focused, and more agile, more able to compete, all we will do is doom ourselves to make the same mistakes. So let's have a look and see what bias has got to do with everything. Gary, this is one of the things that we really have to deal with, and we have to get very comfortable with and understand exactly what we mean when we start to talk about it, okay? Because bias is something that creeps into analytics a lot. And it's your job, and my job as well, right, as data professionals, to ensure that we challenge biases that are creeping into our data, okay? The flip side of this is if you do challenge the biases and actually start to unpick and unpack your data and understand why it's going that way, and not just, well, because it looks like that or because logic says, right, you make a difference to your business. So data analytics and bias are kind of really closely related, aren't they? Because we present things, we present these charts, and it is obvious from looking at this chart. You can look at the data. Deprived places have poorer food hygiene. I can go home now. But is that true? Is that really what this is saying to us? And this is where it gets a bit tricky. Because let's go on. Let's have a look at page 2 of this, right? So the reality check for it, okay? For starters, looking at the changes in score, it goes from 4.42 to 4.7, right? Which on the surface looks huge, but is not as big as you would expect when you actually start to break down the scores and actually what's possible, right? It's not possible for a business to be 4.4. They're either 4 or they're 5. So we've got to the point where the vast majority of businesses in both sides are over 4. Otherwise, the average would be below 4, wouldn't it? Yeah. So most businesses are still getting a 5. So tick. So that's kind of straight away we should be questioning. Well, so, poor food hygiene, clearly that's not true if most places are still over 5. Okay. Then when we start to look at the number of businesses, what we actually see is that there's a trend down. And it goes, from 42,000, nearly 43,000 to 20,500. So we really are like 50% less businesses in IMD 10, which leads to the question, is something else at play there? Now, one of the things I remember when I was at school doing my studying was there was something that was mentioned. There were 2 things that we looked at, okay? One of them was bid rent theory. Okay. Now, bid rent theory is quite clear in what it says. Okay. That basically places people want their business or they want to be located centrally in general. So you want a central location. As such, that means that using capitalist principles, your rents are going to be higher at the more preferred locations. Yeah. So where you want to be, the central places, right, which is with the second theory, Kristalla's central place theory, right? We don't talk about him that much because he's a bit, right, brilliant, genius, but some questionable parts to it. But I didn't say that really, I'm sure. So the question then comes, what happens to that? What does that mean? So if we say the central place that we want to be in, right? And bid rent theory is based around saying, well, it's the centre of town, is your central place. You can also do that with more affluent areas of a city. You could say, well, these are going to have higher rents because people want to be there. And it becomes then a self-fulfilling prophecy that IMD drives IMD, as opposed to it being something that is actually being used to challenge and normalize your environment, because that's not the function of it. The function of it is not to turn around and say, all right, this area has got a low IMD score, it is a deprived area, we need to lift it up, help it become more normalized. And equally, this area is far too affluent and far too undeprived, we need to deprive it a little bit and bring it towards a norm so that everyone is the same. And gosh, that sounds terribly communist, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? That's, if you were doing this and looking at it from a normal business perspective and an analytics perspective, is, well, what do we do to normalize? What do we have to do? And you would pick a level and normalize to it. So as we can't do that, we can't do it. So anyway, okay, bid rent theory. So your central place. Okay, let's go kilometers that way, yeah, and we can go price that way. So what it says is that your rent line would be like that, working, okay, as an example. Okay, Crystallis, like the whole bid rent theory, there's 3 lines. It depends on what you're looking at, offices, shops, or residential. But we'll just look at 1 line for now, okay? So we've got that line here. So in theory, for a restaurant or a food establishment, and bear in mind this is all food establishments, okay, you're going to look and say, well, do we want to be here? Can we be further out? And there's going to be that sweet spot where you're going to have your profitability is going to meet. So you might be a case where it says, for your business, here's where you can afford to be realistically. I want my Michelin starred restaurant. I've got higher profit margins, so I get to be there. Okay. You can kind of work out there's some logic to this. So there's actually a different economic driver going on with the businesses that are going to be situated in those different places. And it's nothing to do with deprivation. It's to do with the cost of doing business. My business, my profit margins would not support me paying that level of rent, given that my other overheads would be effectively the same. You know, there's a different driver. Economic drivers are what would change it. It's not something that you're looking at. This is a different role. Okay. So we get to the point, don't we, that this bid rent theory has a lot of truth that corresponds and that we can show quite clearly in this chart with this downward trend in terms of the numbers. So we've got something that makes sense. It's like, and suddenly it's not about, oh, well, poor people can't have, deprived areas can't have good food, right? It's that, well, we've shown 4.42 is by no means a way of saying, well, that's terrible food. That's good. But still, most of them, the vast majority, are still over 4, so 5. So clearly, there's something else. It's not as clear as all that, is it? Okay. Now, let's cut over into Power BI and have a quick look and see if there's anything else that we can work out from that. All right, Power BI. So what does this show me? So we've got the same chart, haven't we? We've also got the breakdown. We can actually start to look and see different businesses by different scores. We can also see what's the impact regionally. It's the number of businesses. If we were to pick the Northeast, because that's all we really care about, it's the Northeast, okay? We can see that there is a change as well, but it's a lot less marked. And there's some deviation from what we would expect from our expected trends. There are highs and then there's a low here in decile 8, which is, odd to say the least. It's a bit odd, okay? So what we've got to is a point where we can say, well, clearly it's not a universal trend straight away. Okay, checking London again, we've got it drops down from IMD 1 to IMD 2. That is an odd one. Potentially it fits with the concepts of bid rent theory because of mindsets and things like that. The interesting as well, if we go to page 3, okay, I've plotted a multi-chart, so everything's on the same axis, where we've got the businesses and the scores by type. Okay? And in here, we've got some interesting ones, because if we look here, what we've got is some interesting stuff, some quite interesting stuff here. So there's one of the things that really drew my attention to it, and that was takeaways, right? So takeaways, sandwich shops, and things like that. And that's this one, okay? Now, for them, their industry is based around, for a takeaway, isn't it? Or even for a sandwich shop, potentially it's not around how much, I need a nice plush environment. It's about convenience. People are coming, want food quickly, do it. Okay, so it's a very different business model to a restaurant, isn't it? And as such, we do see there's a real corresponding line where it does go down as you go up through, as your rent or your cost of doing business in that location goes up. It goes down. Okay. And then, yes, there is the corresponding increase in food hygiene. But again, it's from above 4, right? Above 4.4, it's high. It's not like, it's terrible. Okay. Interestingly as well, we had universities and colleges where it's pretty university across. Same with hospitals. It's reasonably universal across, and there's a reasonable spread. And that spread helps as well, because that means, doesn't it, that these are the areas where they're almost excluded from bid rent. So a hospital is where it is, isn't it? Because it's a hospital. Restaurants and canteens, we see again, there is something there to it, because you've got it where it goes up and then it comes back down. So there is something going on with this that potentially that does make with the bid rent, that potentially I'm going to be in the best area I can afford to be for my restaurant or canteen or cafe. I don't want it to be there if I can possibly afford, if I can afford the cost of doing business in the next level up. So you kind of get to that there's an aspirational side to that business. But again, be real, right? None of my information that I have is enough to definitively decide and say, it's that, okay? What we can definitely say, though, is that there is no evidence that because you have a lower IMD score, you're going to have poorer food hygiene in the cafes or food establishments in your area. So what do you reckon then? Okay. It's a difficult topic, right? And this is one of the areas that I'm really passionate about. I think it's really important that people and children and everyone gets their head around understanding data, and especially starts to get their head around the idea of challenging data and challenging the assumptions. Because I don't know it all, right? I've just shown you a data set. I've shown you that chart, and that chart is the sort of thing I would expect to see on the news or around me regularly. And it's very misleading because it doesn't actually say what it says, right? It is clear, the assumption, well, clearly we can see. Well, when we take a little moment, step back, ask a couple of questions, it becomes less clear. And once it's less clear, we need to step back from that initial assumption, okay? And that's all I'd ask you to do, right? So take some time whenever you hear things, whenever you see things, be a little bit more aware, think about what's my knee-jerk reaction, and then can I mathematically support that, or is there something else that might be going on here? And it's interesting that when you look at things and you put in concepts like Kristalla central place theory, like bid rent theory, right? And I'll put some links down below for them, right? That there's kind of like, there's more going on in your data, and there's more going on in the world than you're often going to see. Now, for a business, this would be important for me to understand, because I can see, if I want to have a restaurant, I should probably try and be in the most affluent area that we can afford, and potentially that might be where we would stretch our budgets. However, if we looked back at restaurants, we would see that it's a fairly level playing field. So there's actually not much of a difference in terms of scores across them. So it's a much more level score. So what you're saying really is, well, if I go and push my budget and do what I can do, it's not necessarily going to give me a better food hygiene rating. For you as a customer, it should mean, well, I can be reasonably comfortable that going to a more deprived area or less deprived area, I'm going to expect a similar standard of food hygiene across them, which I think is fundamentally the whole point, isn't it, of this whole method of checking. So I hope you understand that. I hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great week. Take care. Ta-da.